Talking through Sean's rest of season running back rankings. That's what we're going to do today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find my Stealing Signals newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. I wrote several thousand words breaking down every single game, the signal, and the noise in every one. That is up for week one. It'll be up every week on Mondays and Tuesdays at that newsletter. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. And you can find all of his fantastic work at RotoViz. Sean this week wrote rest of season rankings for wide receiver and for running back. Titled the running back one, Don't Underreact. So you know with Sean, that means that they are fun overreactions. I'm very excited to dig into these running back rankings. How you doing, Sean?
I'm doing really well. I'm excited for week two. We're sitting here on Wednesday afternoon recording, and it just feels like we're mere hours away from this Chiefs-Chargers game that should be lights out, one of the best games of the season already right here in week two. Then obviously in week one, a lot of things go well. A lot of things go not necessarily poorly, but you're definitely hoping that they improve the following week. I think that the number one thing perhaps that went well for us is that we did get a lot of draft picks, especially in the final week in that 9 through 12 range. You're trying to figure out how you can address it. We have a lot of Barkley Swift teams, and that looks like it will be the home run, at least early. Anytime that your players hit in week one, you're like, oh, this is going to just be the case for the whole season. Last year, Jonathan Taylor, Deandre Swift, those plays tended to be pretty good the whole way, at least until Swift got hurt. Every once in a while, that's a little bit of a head fake in week one. You think you're going to be roaring along, and it turns out the guys are just solid, not fantastic. There is still an issue. Some of our Barkley Swift teams do need some other things to go right. Well, the thing that just really jumped out to me after week one was that the problem with having a late draft slot was not in the first round, even though the big five, and for me that includes Chase and not Eckler, even though they were almost inhumanly good, you could still have these paths at the 1-2 turn with Barkley, with Swift, those kinds of players. But man, you get into round three, that wide receiver tier break looks like even more of a killer now than it did a couple days ago. You get into round five, that round 5 tier break looks like even more of a killer than it did a week ago. So some of the Barkley Swift teams need those guys to play well just so they can kind of live through, kind of bridge the gap to where we can get some of that receiver production, that we have so many of these wide range of outcomes players as the season goes along. They should get better. We're going to mostly focus on running backs today. But first, Ben, I did want to say again, if you haven't been reading Stealing Signals, you're missing out on something that you don't want to miss out on. But what people are telling me is that your service is irresponsibly low priced. I mean, where don't you have some responsibility to your subscribers to actually charge them more and keep out maybe the people who aren't serious? You don't want to be giving away that information to everybody.
I mean, I guess. I don't know. I think it's kind of fun to let everybody in, but I keep hearing this, Sean. I keep hearing this.
Well, Ben, it's going to let everybody in. You pay the, again, irresponsibly low price. You can get Stealing Signals. Then we're going to talk about some of that stuff today. I'll have some notes from the Advanced Stat Explorer over at RotoViz. Obviously, you'll get our takes from watching the games. I have had a chance to watch all of them. I kind of wish that I could erase Browns, Panthers from my memory, that I could erase Texans, Colts from my memory. But if you have drafted Cleveland Browns running backs, you've got to be pretty happy. Those guys don't even need a functional offense to run roughshod over the rest of the NFL. But Ben, we're going to start at the top. Jonathan Taylor, almost an infinite number of carries. Doesn't even need to have a good evasion rate to average over 5 yards per carry, because his ability, when he does get to the second level, is extraordinary. Christian McCaffrey, maybe more disappointing. So you told me that you were still okay with McCaffrey. I had kind of had Taylor at 1 for most of the offseason. I never moved McCaffrey ahead of him in my rankings, but I did have them into more or less a dead heat in my last draft. I did get 101 when you and I were drafting together. And I told you that I selected Taylor in case we would get a 101 so that we could take McCaffrey. I do feel better about that now because I do think that Taylor is the clear number 1. McCaffrey maybe in a battle to stay number 2. Is that too much of an overreaction to how the Panthers looked in week 1?
The Panthers looked terrible. Christian McCaffrey, to me, looked fine. And there's obviously multiple contradictions there, right? Because the Panthers have to be good. But Christian McCaffrey's been really good in some bad Panthers offenses before. The biggest issue for the Panthers was that they only ran 50 plays. They were the lowest on Sunday. The Seahawks came in at 49 pretty hilariously and went underneath them. But 50 plays in a game is a very small amount. But McCaffrey played plenty of snaps. I think it was 81%, ran plenty of routes. I think it was 72% of dropbacks. Those are both off memory. One of them was in the 70s. One was in the 80s. There was concern that he'd be more like a 60% snap player this year. That was not the case. They relied on him heavily as they got behind and needed to. And we talked about this on the wide receiver show already this week, how that played out for the Colts with Jonathan Taylor, and how it looked so bad for Nyheim Hines, even in a script where they threw a ton and were behind and threw 50 passes, that the Colts were like, hey, we're still going to run the ball a ton and we're going to have Jonathan Taylor run more routes than you because even as we're trailing, we need to make sure we're getting him the ball. Panthers seem to respond the same way. We have to have Christian McCaffrey on the field. He only got 4 targets, low number for him. But again, only 50 plays total in a game where they almost can't be lower volume than they were. They threw 27 passes again with the very low number. But of the running back, rush attempts, McCaffrey got 10 of the 13. He was sort of the workhorse from that respect. I mean, obviously 10 carries doesn't feel like a workhorse, but they didn't give away half of his carries. The 4 targets on 27 pass attempts, not as high as his target share can get. Also not so low that you panic in any kind of way in a 1-game sample. I really just see this as a low team volume game. The big part of it for me, when you look at it from a high value touch perspective, they got down inside the 5 on a long Ian Thomas catch on a broken play, immediately gave it to McCaffrey. They did, throw to him out of the backfield, and he catches all of his passes and is efficient at turning targets into receptions because he always has been. He winds up with 5 high value touches, very low number for him, but again, only had 14 touches. So as a rate, when we look at that trap stat, that was the original way that I started looking at high value touches, his trivial rush attempt percentage, pretty low as a percentage of his overall workload. 9 of his 14. It's it was right around 60%. The league average is typically around 75%, higher being worse, meaning that the distribution of the player's touches in terms of their fantasy value is worse. It's more low value touches, the higher that number is. So when he was at 60% and playing a high snap share, you look at him on a per snap basis, high value touches per snap, which I know you can get in the Stealing Signals tool over at RotoViz. And I haven't even looked at this yet, but it will look fine. I'm sure of it because they didn't run a lot of plays. The only real concern would be whether Carolina is going to be so bad that they're averaging, sub 60 plays per game. But Seattle was last in the league last year. I'm pretty sure they were at 59 plays per game, and they were last in the league by a lot. I mean, teams run 60 plus plays per game on average. The Panthers should add 10 plus plays per game. I don't know. I guess I didn't expect McCaffrey to come out and have a monster workload, and especially knowing they're playing the Browns, who are going to run the ball a ton if the game was even relatively close, because Jacoby Brissett's not really a good NFL quarterback. And knowing that Baker struggled as well, McCaffrey got the touches that matter. That's why he still scored 15 plus PPR points. He got the 4 receptions. He got the TD. Not great that he only had 57 yards. Not great that it required a TD for him to get to double digits. And yet, I mean, this was the same Christian McCaffrey profile. He still looked pretty solid. He converted the TD in close. He's still going to have that big roll in close. I guess I can't get that concerned about a 15.7 PPR game in a game that looks like it'll be one of the Panthers' worst, even if they are a bad team.
It's funny that you mentioned how his profile looked in comparison to the other backs, and you go in and look at the numbers. I have the NFL Player Explorer up. You can look at the opportunity tab, specifically the Panthers. And as you mentioned, 43 snaps for McCaffrey, 7 for Foreman, 3 for Hubbard. They only carry 3 times. But as someone watching the game, when they gave those 3 carries to other players, it just blew my mind, right? Because your offense is floundering and you have Christian McCaffrey. One of the things about resting the backs that is sort of a personal theory for me that I would prefer to see these NFL teams employ is I just really want the stars to play and to be game planned for during the times of the game that matter the most, when you're trying to take these leads, and certainly when you're coming from behind. Rest the players once you know that you've used them to the extent that you can, or that you're going to need to within the construct of this game, right? The Panthers end up with such a low number of total plays, which means that they should not have given any touches to somebody else until you kind of had used McCaffrey to the point where you do want to rest him a little bit. I think if you're a Panthers fan, if you're a McCaffrey fantasy manager and you know that he's not up there yet, you know that the Panthers are not scoring, that they could lose a game here to the Cleveland Browns. Again, you really need to win to start your season because McCaffrey essentially doesn't touch the ball that much. And it's both as a runner and as a receiver. They had significant chunks of this game where they did get behind, and yet those McCaffrey out of the backfield plays where he actually gets a downfield target. One of the things with McCaffrey is that he's uncoverable. He is the unique running back who can get some air yards, who can run some patterns down the field. When he runs true patterns, the guy's trying to cover him, whether it's a corner or a safety or especially a linebacker. When he cuts, he's immediately open by like 5 yards. And those plays were not in the game plan here. And so even though once you adjust for the total play volume, his role looks fine, it raised a big red flag to me in terms of just the overall competency of the coaching staff. Baker Mayfield looked like he looked last season when injuries were a big concern. He did not look like somebody who could move an offense. And so one of the things that you had to be betting on a little bit, drafting DJ Moore and drafting McCaffrey at the price, and it's not just Jonathan Taylor, right? One of the things that we saw in a lot of formats was that drafters were very adeptly choosing to go Kupp, choosing to go Jefferson. Those picks look really good after 1 week. I guess I'm concerned because you just have to have a game plan for week 1. I mean, you've had the entire offseason to get ready for the first week. Now, we know a lot of teams actually still don't do it that well. They look like they haven't played their guys in preseason. They look like, they haven't practiced in pads. They've done all of these things to keep everybody healthy, and yet they're not ready for the first game. So we would expect them to react and do a better job. And yet I just don't know how you can have Christian McCaffrey, how you can be in a situation where it's almost a must win, because this coaching staff cannot have another terrible season and not get fired. And you're looking at maybe the softest game on your schedule, and you are not prepared to win it. It's Christian McCaffrey. So, I mean, it's not like he's going to drop outside the top 5. It's not like he's going to drop below a bunch of running backs. I move him to a clear number 2. But I do really think now that when you contrast what the Browns did and then everything that we saw from the Giants, and the Giants still looked bad, right? I mean, Daniel Jones doesn't have anybody to throw to. And yet, almost because of that, there are going to be some creative things with Saquon Barkley. We see Dable go for 2, and just this huge contrast between what looks like the Panthers are going to do and what the Giants, even with a bad team, and even with a team that probably are not going to spring many more upsets like they did against the Titans, that contrast and what we saw from Saquon Barkley really does make me wonder if Barkley now is not almost 50-50 to outscore him.
And I mean, we should obviously be incredibly excited about Barkley. That's a guy that we were already incredibly excited about. And obviously, there are so many reasons to be pumped from week one of which is that the Giants didn't run a lot of plays either. And he still had a fantastic game. So, I mean, I guess I don't want to overreact on McCaffrey, but if we're saying that Barkley got up into that level just by week one, then I'm not necessarily going to dispute that. I'm not concerned significantly with McCaffrey's first game, and yet thrilled about Barkley's. They only run 58 plays. They come out with a negative 14.8 pass rate over expected. Way different than what I expected. I think I wrote in Stealing Signals, it was one of the stats that was most shocking to me from week one. Expected Brian Dable to be very pass heavy. They did try to throw early. Daniel Jones got sacked 4 times in the first half, got strip sacked. They weren't very effective throwing, and Saquon Barkley was the only thing they could get going. And so I think in some respects you can say, them coming out, running the ball with a deficit in the second half makes a lot of sense. And their first play of the second half, Barkley goes for 68 yards, and a few plays later, he rushes in the touchdown. I talked about how McCaffrey got the green zone work. Barkley got all 4 of the green zone touches for the Giants. He caught 6 balls, even though they only threw 21 times. He gets 7 targets, a 33% target share for a running back. He's always had good target shares. Kind of a low-key thing about Barkley. I think people think of him as this rush efficiency guy. He's always had target shares like around 20%. I mean, like Alvin Kamara type target shares. Some of that was, Eli Manning and then now Daniel Jones being sort of dump-off guys. But at the same time, he's doing something to get a little bit open, and or his teams are like, we're just going to get him the ball regardless. We're going to be quick to check down because we have Saquon Barkley. Like, whatever it is, they only throw 21 times. He still winds up with, and only run 58 plays. He still winds up with 10 high-value touches. I said not being concerned about McCaffrey's 5 because of the low volume. You have to be thrilled about Barkley's 10. He matches Joe Mixon, for example. They were tied for second most in week one. Mixon's 10 touches come along with 24 low-value touches. I was just talking about the rate, right? Mixon's rate looks a lot more like an average, league average rate in terms of how many of his touches were high-value touches. He had 34 total touches. He was slightly, more positive in terms of his trap rate in week one. His workload looked slightly below the 75% average I was saying. So that's actually better for him. But what I'm trying to say is when the Bengals throw 54 times and run all those plays, that, Mixon's 10 high value touches don't look like they can be quite as sustainable. And a lot of his usage was in the low value areas as Barkley's, which were massive even despite really low pass volume. 21 passes. It was 53 for the Bengals. So, I mean, like 2.5 times as many passes with the Bengals. You think about it in terms of target share in those regards. I guess I'm not that concerned about the negative 14.8 pass rate over expected and how run heavy they went because they didn't get anything going passing. They had the 5 sacks. So by the end of the game, Daniel Jones was a bad pick. He has the strip sack fumble. He's checking down to Barkley. So even when they're calling pass plays, he's not even necessarily getting the ball downfield. He scrambled a few times. They did finally hit Sterling Shepard for a deep touchdown, which was big. I think the passing game desperately needs to actually play Kadarius Toney. We're getting the shades of Brandon Ayuk from last year, but Toney actually looked pretty electric on his 2 rushes in this game, played only a few snaps. Really shocking that they didn't play him more, even as Wan'Dale Robinson goes out early. We kind of got the indication that Toney might not play a ton.
Well, you got Richie James. I don't know that.
Yeah.
And you're saying that Kadarius Toney could help this passing offense?
Yeah, Richie James, highest targeted receiver. Galladay looks like everyone said that he isn't as healthy as he should be at this point, I guess. Looks very stiff, doesn't earn many targets. Shepard, great story. Despite the Achilles, has this long touchdown, key part of their win, but only earned, I think, 4 targets. Also not like probably to his peak self and what he can be, and hopefully he gets there. But passing attack looked terrible. And because of that, they just relied more on Barkley. I guess if there's a slight concern with Barkley, it's okay. He had a 68-yard run. He was super efficient running, even though they went really run heavy. Some of that was probably helped out by the defenses, the Titans defense expecting pass, being up a couple scores. Is this sustainable? Is his rushing efficiency sustainable over a long haul where teams are very, aware that they're going to run a ton if that's the way that the offense goes? We talked about with Taylor that he's unstoppable even though teams know he's going to run. But there's an offensive line gap here as well, right? And that's been part of the issue with Barkley in the past. You talk about the sacks that Daniel Jones took and everything. The line isn't very good in New York. Super excited about Barkley. Not trying to, put any kind of concern whatsoever. Super excited about his 10 high-value touches on such a low-volume team game.
Are you saying he's not going to average 7.1 yards after contact per attempt for the season?
Yeah, that I guess is all that I'm really saying, because I do think the receptions are still going to be fantastic. He's a top 3 running back. I wrote that as well. It seems that's actually a pretty popular opinion. It doesn't surprise me you have him as a top 3 running back, but I saw other people commenting similarly that maybe didn't have him ranked RB4 like you and I did in the preseason. And so for him to be a top 3 running back rest of the season, not particularly bold relative to where we had him. But yeah, I mean, there's nothing in Saquon's week 1 that's really that concerning other than just their offense is bad too.
He still plays for the Giants. Yeah.
Yeah.
The difference in coaching there, I think, is going to be the real key. And while it could hold him back to an extent, if he is healthy, to have that scheme, that coaching staff, and to be that good, I'm very excited about him. Probably the more controversial one is to move DeAndre Swift up to number 4 ahead of Austin Eckler. They had very different games in terms of being on opposite ends of the spectrum from a scoring perspective, arguably from a usage perspective. But this is one where I think a lot of people are going to say, look, this was just 1 week. And it's a little bit silly to make that move, knowing what we know about both teams. To a certain extent, this plays into kind of our fun bold predictions where we're saying that DeAndre Swift can be the sort of 2013 Jamal Charles, right? And one of the arguments for Swift is that even though he hasn't posted these extreme after contact numbers in the past, he's one of, right there with, say, Miles Sanders, who also looked very good in terms of breaking off some big plays in week 1. But DeAndre Swift, probably the best pre-contact runner in football, which is something that matters. If you can consistently get through the hole like Jamal Charles did, so much of Charles' brilliance was based on the ability to get through holes that nobody else could get through. Part of it vision, a lot of it explosiveness, a little bit perhaps scheme. We do think that the Lions will be a good blocking team. Swift, I mean, you look at 1 week and these numbers are not nearly as relevant, but 4 yards per carry, both before and after contact. Jamal Charles, one of the things that I wrote about with him very much back at the beginning of doing fantasy analysis was that his numbers before and after contact were similar to the weakest running backs in the NFL, just total, right? And so you look at what Swift did here. Yes, he loses the 2 touchdowns to Jamal Williams, but this was almost because he was so good. He'd been breaking off such massive chunk plays that they had to let him go to the sidelines and rest a bit. Jamal Williams actually looked very good on the 2 touchdown runs specifically. On his other 9 carries, you watched it and thought, I mean, you've got to get him out of there. They're behind. They're in the shootout with the Eagles. You cannot waste any of your plays that you get in this game on Jamal Williams. If you need to have a break for DeAndre Swift, Just make it a passing play to Amon-Ra or DJ Chark or Hawkinson. I think that Swift is continuing to ascend. We had him in the first round of next year's drafts. Obviously, he was going at the 1-2 turn this year, so that's not a crazy bold prediction, but he does have to have a very good season to get up into that mid-first round. By contrast, the Chargers, this was the exact opposite of what you said in our wide receiver show, where you mentioned that the Raiders were very concentrated and you could feel good, at least in the passing game, that their stars were going to get the work. The Chargers were all over the place using all types of players. One of the things that Eckler himself said this offseason is he doesn't want to have as many carries and that they're going to use the backups more. I don't know that you can do that when you have the guys active that they had active in this game. Maybe when Isaiah Spiller has come along enough to be the backup, you can do that. So I think that they're going to have to rely on Eckler more. But week 1 did raise some red flags and kind of put him back almost in that range, I think, that you would say he was in before last season. And people will look at some of the efficiency numbers and say that they do matter, they don't matter. 2019, 2020, he was a guy who was neutral to a little bit below average in terms of fantasy points over expectation purely as a runner. He's always been a guy who I love the small guys. I love the athletic guys. I love the pass catching backs. I think that they're underrated from a reality perspective, but we do have to also consider just what the profiles are for the players. And Eckler is not the pure runner, even that some of the other small backs are. He's definitely not the pure runner that some of the big backs are. His fantasy points over expectation as a rusher specifically were up last year. I don't think that he can. I don't think it's likely. He can. I don't think it's likely he does that again. You're not going to move him down very far. He would still be a first-round pick if we drafted again this weekend. He's a fantastic player. We have a guillotine league where we're probably going to go after him. But I do think it's fair to move him down to RB5.
I think the Eckler-Swift discussion is a really good one. I definitely think Barkley at 3 makes sense. The Chargers didn't get any running back green zone touches in this game. All 3 of their touchdowns were from a little bit of distance. Outside of their fullback, who caught a short touchdown, the Chargers didn't get any true running back green zone touches in this game. Their other 2 passing touchdowns were from distance. You mentioned how they spread the ball around a bunch. 7 guys tied for 4 targets as the most targeted player. I don't know that I've seen that in a really long time. Like, you don't usually see you see teams that have a lot of guys involved, and I mean, nobody targeted more than 4 times in a 34 pass attempt game because 7 dudes are all at 4. Keenan Allen was one of those and would have went above it, but left early. Obviously disappointing number for somebody like Mike Williams and for Eckler to only get the 4 targets. He only runs routes on, I believe it was 38%. 37% is the number of dropbacks, which is very low for him. But it was kind of interesting. I mean, he didn't play a lot in the preseason. You look back at last year's week 1, he didn't catch a pass, wasn't even targeted. The next week, he catches 9 balls. I called that noise in week 1 last year. I was very excited about his green zone role in week 1 last year. He had a rushing TD and thought that his high value role was going to materialize, even though I wasn't really on him a ton last year. I was like, right after week 1, Eckler looks like he's going to be a stud. And he was. Grateful to call that. I felt similarly this year watching this, that number 1, Keenan Allen's now hurt. I don't see really any scenario where Eckler's route rate stays at this 37% range and he's so uninvolved in the passing game. They're going to need to lean on him more as a receiver, which he's so good at. Number 2, you talked about the fantasy points over expected on the rushing side. So much of that for him last year was the touchdowns. He winds up with 20 TDs. I did see a note that he played all of the running back snaps inside the 10. I think there was 4, and he was on the field for all of them. That was a very positive sign. If they do, well, they will, when they do, get some running back green zone touches going forward, it seems like it's going to be him. It seems like he mostly only gave up low value touches other than some routes. And Josh Kelly catches 2 balls and runs routes on 29% of dropbacks. I don't see how Eckler and Kelly can be at 37 and 29% route rates. There's no way they can be that close. It doesn't make any sense, and it can't carry over. That just seems like such a noisy week 1 number. So I guess for me, it's okay. They didn't get the green zone looks, which he doesn't necessarily have to be efficient as a rusher from a yards per carry standpoint to be good at fantasy points over expected as a runner. He needs to convert touchdowns. It does seem like he might get that work again this year with those, the 4 snaps he had in close. So I think that part of it works out for him. And I also think the receiving, which was light here, works out for him. Not a great week 1, but I do think there's a decent amount of noise here, and I'm not super concerned about Eckler. The question I'd have for you on Swift, who was great and looked so explosive, a lot like what we talked about with Barkley. It was so fun, obviously. Somebody we have a lot of and we're excited about with Swift. He was both of our running back 5 when we went over our rankings, had the same top 5. Jamal Williams got 4 of the 5 carries inside the 10-yard line in the green zone, which I look at with high-value touches. Swift did run a ton of routes, 64%, very strong number. Williams got 5 of the 6. So they got 6 running back touches in the green zone. 5 of them went to Jamal Williams. He scores the 2 touchdowns. Swift hasn't always been a high snap share player, but what's been so great about him is he has the passing work, and he also tended to get way more of the green zone work. We were all concerned that their big hype man, Jamal Williams from Hard Knocks, that they all seem to love, is now their big bruiser and their emotional guy that they want to give the to me. I'm just sort of annoyed, but I feel like this is almost like Dan Campbell's personality and Jamal Williams' personality, the excitement and the love they feel for their team is so close that it's almost like a reward for just being such an optimist that he gets to be the touchdown guy now. But I mean, last year Swift had substantially more work in the green zone. It seems like that could flip now.
Yeah, I mean, you have to deal with that possibility, but I think that this one was really the result of how many touches and how many long gains that Swift had. And he did have a sequence where he gained 7 yards from the 14. Then they handed off to him on a sweep. He scores a 7-yard rushing touchdown in these drives where Jamal Williams scores. Swift was the engine for that. The second rushing touchdown of Jamal Williams comes one play after Deandre Swift catches a 25-yard pass. And we talk about all these great rushing numbers from this game. His play on this particular reception really brought them back into the game. And as he gets knocked out at the 1, I mean, you're thinking to yourself, well, obviously they're going to bring in Jamal Williams now, and you're going to lose that touchdown. And so when he isn't able to cut at the 1, because the defender does come in and very cleanly takes him out, really blocks off that route there, but you're dreaming that he can make that guy miss at the 1-yard line, even after everything's already done on that play. I think that this is a little bit fluky. Jamal Williams didn't look good other than the touchdown runs, and he didn't look good last year. But you never know, right? I mean, Jamal Williams was a little better with the Packers than I think people realize. He has been a trendy handcuff / a little bit of standalone goal line value in fantasy. It's not impossible that Jamal Williams does have some value here, especially if the Lions are extremely high scoring. But this will be one where, I mean, you want Swift to get those touches, because when your team does have touches from the 1-yard line, and if you're a running back who's going to challenge 20 points per game, I mean, you have to score touchdowns. You can't do it just with yards and receptions. I guess I'm still not worried about that element in this particular game, because he does score a rushing touchdown, and because some of the key touches he lost were based on just his brilliance getting them down there.
That's fair. But I guess I'm concerned that it'll be at, sort of at best a 50-50 split. And like you said, you want a guy who's getting all of that working close. So a little bit of a bummer note on Swift's week 1 that Williams got so much more. I mean, that reception play setting up the Jamal Williams short touchdown, I believe I missed that. So that's while watching it. So I can't even remember the Swift catch. So that's a good note. I mean, that's something that there's some signal there. I should have caught that for the stealing signal subs. I'm disappointed in myself. But the first drive, Swift had the long run. Williams came in, and then Swift came back in and got them down in close. Got them into the red zone. Then Hawkinson catches a pass to the 5, and then Williams comes back in at the 5 and runs twice in a row. First drive of the year. I mean, maybe they're just sort of using them both on the first drive, but that one was a little disappointing to see. You talked about the one with the 2 7-yard runs. Williams came in for a carry in between that and got stuffed, and then they brought Swift back on. So maybe it will be more 50-50. Maybe it is just sort of a rotation, and it just worked out that Williams got the 5 green zone touches out of 6 just based on sort of sequencing and where the cutoffs are and all of those things. But sure would have been cooler if Swift got the 5 green zone touchdown touches.
It definitely would have been.
It could have been a 3 touchdown game. I mean, this is the type of game where you're looking at it and you're going, okay, he was awesome and I love this and this is great. But like, this could have been a 3 touchdown game for him. Right?
And I think that listeners, to an extent, will be thinking, I mean, don't get greedy. I mean, you got the points that a lot of other fantasy managers would have loved in week 1.
And
but at the same time, it's massive games that carry you through the season. It's massive games to get you the point totals in leagues where points scored matter. And obviously, when you're looking at what's the upside in the fantasy playoffs, it's massive games that win you tournaments. So merely being excellent instead of otherworldly, that's a difference that matters.
It's a huge difference, and a huge part of that, in the way that I would frame it, is the team green zone touches in this one. We're at 6. You're not going to get that every week. I just talked about how the Chargers had 0 in a game where the Chargers scored plenty of points and were effective on offense, because sometimes the team scores from 15 yards out, right? Like, you just don't get touches inside the 10 because you're scoring from too far, basically.
What I'm hearing you say is that Deandre Swift is going to score a lot of touches from outside the 10.
I mean, that would be fantastic. I would love to see that. But when you get into a game where your team gets 6 touches in the green zone, I don't have an easy list of all the team green zone touches. I can't tell you whether that was the most this week. I bet you it was top 5 based on just, historically having looked at green zone touches a lot. 6 green zone touches for running back room is a lot in 1 week. That's the game where you want 3 touchdowns. That's the game where the elite running backs do get 3 touchdowns. I think that's the game when the Chargers have that game, Austin Eckler might have 3 touchdowns. And so this is 4-5.
Still competing with Joshua Kelly and
yes.
I mean, it's hard to even remember the names. Oh, Sony
Michel. Sony Michel, who carried 7 times for 12 yards. I think there was a reason Miami cut him. But no, I don't think you're necessarily wrong here. I think this is a very fun debate between Swift and Eckler for the 5 spot. At 6, you have Dalvin Cook. Dalvin Cook played a ton, just an absolute ton. Ran routes on a massive number of dropbacks. Don't have that number really close, but I think it might have been the highest of any running backs. It was 70%. So it wasn't the highest because I believe McCaffrey was 75%. I might have misspoke a moment ago, but I did double check that. He was at 75%. Anyway, very high number for Cook. Looked like just an absolute workhorse. Looked like he's going to get tons of rush attempts as well. All the opportunity he can to be an elite running back. The question for me just still remains, how well does the shoulder hold up? He hasn't played more than 14 games in a season in his career. I was kind of telling people I totally see the huge upside, and part of the reason I have him drafted lower or ranked lower is just that concern that he's never played more than 14 games in a season. You can call me, wrong for that, because there's a lot of other running backs where I say I don't really care about injury risk, but he has a legitimately recurring thing. So anyway, if you have Cook, he looks amazing. Hopefully he stays healthy. Do you have any other big notes on Cook?
No, just that I think that when you look at the way this game played out, It's almost, for me, a little bit similar to the situation with Cooper Kupp and the Rams, where I just think it's bad for everybody else. I mean, Justin Jefferson is such a massive part of what they're going to do, and he's so much better as a wide receiver even than Dalvin Cook is as a running back. I mean, Dalvin Cook, one of the best pure runners in football, definitely in that group of players who make the first guy miss. And so his pre-contact numbers are always really impressive. But not only does he have these injury concerns, but his efficiency really dropped last season. It's not something to where you would move him way down, and we didn't move him way down. But I guess I have a little bit of concern there. The Rams, number 30 in receiving expected points to running backs last year. I think especially if you have Justin Jefferson, it will be a little bit challenging for Cook to have the receiving value he needs to be kind of that, again, that legendary profile, even if he's running a bunch of routes.
Yep, I think that makes a lot of sense. Jefferson is good. Javonte Williams, you have at number 7. I think there was reasons to be encouraged. There was reasons to be a little disappointed. The Melvin Gordon fumble at the goal line, I think, gave him a crack to really separate in this first game if he could have then converted on the next time down there. But then he fumbles as well. And they've liked Gordon more in close. It was a 3-2 split towards Gordon on the green zone touches. This is a team that had 5 green zone touches as well. But he caught all of these passes. And we talked on the receiver show about how some of that was probably the Seahawks defense. They've had games like that before. I remember a game against the Saints a few years ago. One of the first ones Drew Brees missed, where it must have been Bridgewater, but Alvin Kamara caught like 16 passes or whatever it was. I mean, just an absolutely absurd game. The Seahawks love to just sort of let running backs, and the Saints won the game because of it. It was like they were just giving up so much yardage, not guarding Alvin Kamara. The Broncos, frankly, should have won this game because of that. But I thought Javonte Williams looked really good. He looked explosive as a runner. He was my preseason running back 7. So you, with this ranking, are acknowledging that I was right.
Exactly. For me here, so these were the pre-Monday night rankings. This article came out on Monday. And my note for him was that sometimes you move up by not playing. Now, obviously, he has played. And Ben, I would still have him at number 7 after having watched this game. This one you could see through almost any lens that you wanted, because Melvin Gordon, frankly, played more and got more of the high-value touches than you want to see. But Javonte Williams is just too good. And I think if you could pick him up anywhere, because people are not seeing the rushing numbers that they wanted, and they're not seeing the Broncos look as good as was expected in week 1, because part of the thesis for Williams is that he can actually be in a timeshare because the Broncos are going to score that many points. And so there are going to be some fantasy managers who now maybe are more skeptical about how many points the Broncos score. I mean, Javonte Williams is just too good. There just aren't that many other running back options, even though obviously the first 2 rounds of fantasy drafts were still pretty running back heavy this year.
And he led the NFL in high-value touches in week 1, largely because of that receiving role. I don't expect him to catch 11 balls a week. I do think, number 1, he ran routes on 62% of dropbacks. Very strong number. Melvin Gordon was only at 29%. Looks a lot like Swift's number in terms of how that split works. And maybe we should think of Javonte and Gordon a little bit more like Swift and Jamal Williams, because number 2, it was a 60-40 split, right? And I talked about this all offseason that I thought by – at least by like week 3 or week 4, we'd see enough good stuff from Javonte Williams. It would be a 60-40 split. A lot of people this offseason were talking about how you look at last year, it was very 50-50. They really like Melvin Gordon. They're going to use Melvin Gordon. They did, and they do. And that's all true. But it wasn't last year's split. I want to emphasize that. This is a big difference, actually. And even though Javonte only got 7 carries, he played a lot in the passing downs. They did have a lot more passing downs. It's possible it shifts back to more 50-50 if they don't have as many passing downs next week. But even early in the game, it was Javonte on the early downs running the ball. It wasn't necessarily Melvin Gordon working in. He did work in a little. But the first long run Javonte had 9 or 10 yards. He's still on the field a couple plays later and has another long run. efficient running the ball. Only 7 carries, picks up 43 yards, over 6 yards a carry. Gordon looked good too. We've talked a lot about how Gordon is good. We drafted him on some teams. He's worth playing. His fumbling near the goal line, not ideal. Seemed to be a little bit more on him. I mean, look, I'm super biased, but Javonte gets blown up by a lineman right in his face, and before he even tries to move to the side, the ball gets punched out. Gordon's was him not really protecting the ball. All right, whatever. I'm biased.
But this needs to be even more. This needs to be 65-35 clearly for it to be Javonte Williams as a good second-round pick. And we're now moving him up to where we're saying he could be almost a 1-2 turn kind of player. And, I mean, everything was positive. And yet, within the context of the actual game, it was a little disconcerting. I mean, you've got Javonte Williams. How can you come out in the second half after not looking good against the Seattle Seahawks and have Melvin Gordon be the guy who's carrying the ball to start the second half there? That was so weird to me.
But I think the way that Javonte looked, the point I'm trying to make is we started at 60-40. We didn't start at 50-50, and I thought things would shift towards Javonte. The way that he looked, I think we're due to shift. I mean,
he's so good.
Like I said, maybe it was a 60-40 because there was so much passing and he's their passing back. And maybe it will shift back towards 55-45 next week, which would be really a bummer. But I do think by like week 8, we're going to be 65-35 or more. And it might be a lot sooner. So I don't know. I was very excited. I think like I said, I think the 11 catches not going to carry over. And yet he was like a very effective part of their passing game, 65 receiving yards, not like a massive number, but a lot of plays where he was making guys miss and gaining yardage. You know, all of those catches were near the line of scrimmage, right? I don't know if that's 100% true, but it seemed like a lot of them were, frankly, behind the line of scrimmage, and then he's turning them into positive yardage. It would not surprise me if he had more yards after the catch than he even had receiving yards, which happens with running backs sometimes because it basically means that their average catch was behind the line of scrimmage. And that actually is true. He had 85 yards after the catch. He had 65 receiving yards. So his 11 catches netted him at the catch point, negative 20 receiving yards. On average, he was catching the ball 2 yards behind.
Well, that's not good then. That's not the air yards we want from him.
Those are not the air yards we want from him, but those are the plays that show up on tape and all of those things. So anyway, I think he's going to be just fine, even as the receiving comes down a little bit. I didn't catch that you had sent this piece out before he even played. So very, very funny response when I said that you had said I was right by moving him up to number 7, and it was before his game even started. 3 more players in your top 10, though. All very, very interesting. All guys that we have had a lot of discussions about, not necessarily being fans of. I talked a little bit about Joe Mixon during the Barkley thing. There was a lot of low-value touches there. They ran 94 plays, more plays than any team did in any game all of last year, and more plays than anyone else in week 1. They played 5 full quarters. I just don't think he's going to have a lot of 34-touch games. And you were talking during our receiving show about how, I mean, he was very inefficient. Those Mixon touches were not helping the offense. That was like one of the Burrow took a lot of hits early. They had to pivot. They had to run the ball some, but he was very inefficient as well.
You need to have some JP Ryan on every team.
Yeah, pretty happy about that. So you have Mixon at 9. You have Fournette all the way up to number 8. You have Derrick Henry sliding back a little bit to number 10. What'd you see with those guys?
Well, Fournette, he actually looked like a decent running back for one of the first times in his career. And I just think the Buccaneers are going to be able to control games with the schedule that they have. We obviously are not on Fournette for a variety of reasons that are more off the field, really, than on the field. Derrick Henry, he had the game to start last season, 17 carries, 58 yards. Then he goes on a string of 5 consecutive 100-yard games where he scores a total of 10 touchdowns. The debut in this one with 21 carries for 82 yards. That's disappointing, but it's not some huge deal for Henry. I think that it sort of sneakily, the fact that Treylon Burks look good, and this offense, I think, is going to be functional despite the fact that they do manage to go out and lose to the Giants in the first game. I think that will be good for Henry. Partly those guys are there because Alvin Kamara and Najee Harris, you have to move down. And the Saints, they were far worse than the score indicated. And that's one of those games where you really want Kamara to have a lot of the receiving numbers. You mentioned a game where he had 16 receptions against the Seahawks a couple of years ago. One of the big problems with his profile last year is that in the absence of Drew Brees, they used him as a runner much more. Now, he's still very good at that, but like with Dalvin Cook, his efficiency numbers plummeted. Part of that is potentially the fact that he's getting out of that range that we think of as being ultra explosive for running backs from, say, age 21 to age 25. A lot of it is simply usage and the fact that the offense is no longer as dynamic without the quarterback play there. Jameis Winston looked awful, and I think that it's going to be a big problem for him. Najee Harris, I mean, this was a pure Trent Richardson game. Even though he does get the receiving touchdown, he has the foot injury. Probably not a big deal. I don't really think that the handcuffs to Harris have much value either. Now, if you're looking at a 0 or something like that in your RB2 slot, certainly playing someone who's on the field is helpful. It was kind of funny, Ben, my best team of the first week was one where I scored 170 some points. It looks like it's going to be very good. The humorous thing about it is that my 4 running backs are Jonathan Taylor, J.K. Dobbins, Kenneth Walker, and then before the games on Sunday, I had a Ty Chandler who also was inactive. So I'm looking at a 0 in that RB2 spot until those other guys play. It still is maybe my best team. You know, we could argue again about the importance. What's that?
Who did you start?
Well, I put Ty Chandler in, even though he was inactive.
Had to get him in one starting lineup.
That's right. So, and it may be the only time that Chandler starts all season, a game in which he could not have scored a fantasy point. The backups to Najee Harris probably worth more than starting an inactive player, but I don't know that it's that much more. The Steelers offense is not going to be good for the running backs. My thought here is that Ben Roethlisberger, no arm, but some veteran savvy. The young guys, plenty of arm. They don't have that savvy. This is not a team where you want to throw to the running back because Deontay Johnson, when he makes that Odell Beckham catch in this game, I'm of two minds on him because, again, the offense looked so bad, but he is Deontay Johnson. You also have Chase Claypool, who they involved more or less as a running back. He was playing the Jonnu Smith role. You have George Pickens, who they couldn't get involved. You had Pat Freiermuth, who actually looked great. If you can't run the ball, and it doesn't look like the Steelers will be able to do that, Najee Harris, probably not a threat. I mean, we're not on him. So again, we talk about what types of things do you underreact to, what types of things do you overreact to, how it's impossible not to see the first week through the lens of your own rankings. But I think that our thesis for Harris and why you would want to avoid him was crystal clear in this game, even though he got a receiving touchdown.
Yep, and I wrote in Stealing Signals, I think we are, despite the win, 1 week closer to Kenny Pickett. So maybe some of that gets a little bit better if Pickett actually plays well. But they got the strip sack touchdown, right? They scored on that, or was that just the Dolphins? Anyway, they got at least a strip sack that led to a short TD, if nothing else. Got a bunch of turnovers, could do nothing offensively. I mean, the reason the Bengals ran 94 plays is the Steelers, despite all of their takeaways and all of their opportunities, only ran 61. They couldn't keep the ball. They did not have a good offensive game, despite beating the last year's Super Bowl runners-up. Their defense played way better than what their offense gave them. But they got the win. I do think we're 1 week closer to Kenny Pickett. If they have a bad loss in the next couple of weeks, I could see a switch pretty quick.
You're not anticipating too many games that they win with a 32-13 deficit in first downs?
No. Yeah, that's not the recipe you're looking for. One of the guys you have in your rising section really stuck out to me. That's Clyde Edwards-Helaire. You noted that he scored 22 points on 10 opportunities. 12 of those, and actually 14, the PPR element, were on designed plays. I got quite the kick out of him doing the Michael Jordan shrug as he walked in on a play Michael Jordan can do that shrug when he makes 7 straight threes, but Clyde Edwards-Helaire did absolutely nothing on that play other than
Was it
himself.
not? I mean, you don't give him credit for the fact that there were no defenders in the vicinity?
I think I could give him credit for the fact that he's not very good until the defense didn't account for him. I think, if anything, it was a slap in the face because they weren't that concerned. The little shovel pass inside was also, purely design. The Kansas City offense looked incredible, and I will give CEH credit that he ran the ball well. He looked like a good runner. Isaiah Pacheco also ran well, almost all in garbage time, 10 of his 12 carries in the fourth quarter. Having said that, the fact that he ran well at that time, I wrote, is probably bad news for Ronald Jones, who we love getting, on the field ever anytime soon. Part of the hope with him was even if he was inactive week 1, if they didn't run effectively, they might switch that pretty quickly. I think we're heading for a Rojo inactive in week 2 as well.
He's going to be inactive. I do want to ask you about this from a tactical perspective as you're doing your waivers. Now, this show is going to come out after waivers, but a lot of managers are going to be in a situation where they have a second waiver period and just have first come, first serve. Ronald Jones is going to be available almost everywhere. And a lot of my co-managers have put him in as the drop to pick up players who might not be inactive week 2. We were hoping, this is a tricky one because on the one hand, you're hoping that something in the Chiefs game opens up a role for Ronald Jones. And you're hoping that happens without somebody getting hurt. We're not rooting for injuries. At the same time, the Chiefs offense was so effective that it was almost as though the Arizona Cardinals defense was not on the field. Now, maybe the Cardinals are going to turn out to be one of the NFL's worst defenses. But watching how easily the Chiefs running backs scored points in week 1 and knowing how relatively mediocre Edwards-Helaire is as a talent, knowing how relatively, maybe just above mediocre Ronald Jones is, but probably just above mediocre. I guess I don't afford. Obviously, if you have someone good available in your league, you want to pick him up. If you're talking about picking up like the 4th string running back for the 49ers or other players who were inactive, Darnus Johnson, someone who still vaguely interesting, even with what happened there. I guess for me, I'm still actually on some of the guys who were inactive, like Isaiah Spiller, after you see what happens with the running backs they actually decided to play. With the Chiefs and the Chargers, you have offenses where with the Chiefs, the best back, with the Chargers, the second best back, may have been inactive week 1, but those teams are going to score so many points that when you're looking at how do you build a juggernaut that can win leagues and win tournaments, I guess I almost moved Jones up a little bit mentally because you can see how this Chiefs offense will be different than the one from the last 2 or 3 years where there weren't a lot of holes and it just wasn't that favorable in offense for running backs, even with how many points the Chiefs scored. I think that's going to be different this year. Is thinking that CEH and Pacheco looked so good is actually a pretty positive for all of these Chiefs backs. Is that an overreaction to what may just be an atrocious Cardinals team?
It's a very interesting take. It's all the backs did look good. I was going to make an anti-CEH case largely on the idea that McKinnon ran more routes than him, that Pacheco ran well enough that he might actually work in a little bit more in the early downs, that he's in a 3-way committee, even in a really good offense, and both of his touchdowns were these design plays, and he didn't actually get a whole lot of touches, and their offense isn't going to be run through the running backs very much anyway, and so you might actually have a really nice sell high window right now after a big first game. The thought on Jones, in terms of the tournaments and stuff that we play, it fits. It makes perfect sense. We have deeper leagues. We have the roster spots. I think for a lot of listeners who are playing in shallower leagues, you want to be churning those last spots with more short-term potential. But you also, with Jones, it's something where if there is an injury in week 4, I mean, I guess I think he's still going to be pretty acquirable. I think people are going to be all over. Like, let's say CH has an unfortunate injury. I think people are going to be all over McKinnon and Pacheco mattering. There will be some interest in Rojo, but I think people in those leagues will be able to get him at that point. So wasting the roster spot in a 16-man roster league through that point rather than, potentially churning to, like you said, the Niners' fourth running back, but like Jeff Wilson's probably their RB1 right now, and he's available in a lot of those types of leagues. So I'd rather have Jeff Wilson.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely would rather have Jeff Wilson.
Yeah. So it depends on league size. It depends on a lot of stuff. In terms of the big tournaments, deep rosters, and probably anticipating in the deeper leagues that even if a running back injury occurs and Ron Jones looks like he's going to be active, he might still be pretty acquirable. I mean, it's sort of a game of how much do people care about Ronald Jones. I think we might still be able to get him back even when that opportunity arises, right? And so there's an element of that you don't want to get to not be using that roster spot. It's very important to have that flexibility.
I guess for me, the other question would be, or the other point would be that in 20 roster spot leagues, and then there's a huge difference between 16 and 20, but in 20 spot leagues, but I don't ever remember a week or a week one where the waiver wire is as barren as it is this week. I mean, this is the most barren I've ever seen it. And this is really the first time ever that I could imagine going through week 1 to week 2 and basically making no changes.
Yep.
And that's despite the fact that there are some players that could cut. I think that Trey McBride is going to still have a good season, still have a good career. When I saw, it's kind of funny too what your individual trigger points are. But when I saw them come out with the inactives and he was inactive, like the Cardinals are going to lose this game by 50 because you're clearly not ready to play this season. So,
I mean, how stupid. Like, we did this with Rondale Moore last year. I mean, Cliff Kingsbury, the young coach, the suave coach with the beautiful house and all of these things, like, how is this the dude that thinks that rookies can't produce in the modern NFL? Like, he did it all year last year with Rondale. He wasn't even going to use him, wasn't even going to try.
Is this a thing? Cliff Kingsbury has a nice house?
Yeah, he has like a really nice house. There's like pictures of him sitting outside. It's open air and stuff. It's cool. I think it's a cool house.
Okay. Well, that actually encourages me. Maybe Trey McBride will be active this next week.
No, the problem is those pictures were a year old and he's still like coaches like Pete Carroll. Like, what? Anyway, the Trey McBride thing was absolutely impossible to understand other than just stupidity, like literal stupidity. Like, oh yeah, he's not ready because he's a rookie. Like, put your talent on the field. Like, understand that rookies are going to make some mistakes, but don't be an idiot. All right, moving on. Ronald Jones is still worth holding in 20 roster spot leagues because there's not a lot of guys to add. That's where we were going, and you mentioned the Trey McBride stuff. And I agree with you. It's not a great waiver wire week at all. I want to stash Rojo wherever we can, at least for a couple more weeks. I'm with you.
So let me ask you about the risers then. My other 3 risers, and I mean, these aren't going to be surprising. They're players who were just either on the edge of or just outside the dead zone, the kinds of guys who in a 1-week situation can be very exciting. I don't think people would be surprised that they had big weeks. I still think it's a positive sign because even though we know that they've had big weeks in the past and probably these are fluky big weeks, it's still better to have them in week 1 than later. Kareem Hunt, Cordero Patterson, Antonio Gibson. Do you have a preference out of those 3, kind of related again to cost and expectation? And do you have one where you think it's actually going to carry through a little bit? I mean, Patterson benefits obviously from Damian Williams leaving early. I still really want to see Tyler Algier in this offense. Mostly I want the Falcons to throw the ball more. Antonio Gibson for me demonstrated that, while he's not probably ever going to be as good as the fantasy community has wanted, he's not as bad as the Washington coaches have been constantly making out. And I think that's a disservice to him and a disservice to their team. I mean, he's a good player. You're the Washington Commanders coaches. let's lift these guys up, not try and make them feel like they're not going to be parts of what. I mean, the Commanders, if you have a quarterback in there, and Carson Wentz should get a ton of credit for leading them back to the victory in week 1. If you have an above average quarterback and you look down the line a couple of years with Sam Howell, we may be way off on him, but if he emerges or they get somebody else, this Commanders team could be really fun.
Yeah, Gibson was a really interesting one, and I saw some comments about how Brian Robinson will probably be back at some point, and I mean Gibson has the potential to change what they were thinking with Brian Robinson for this year at least, or at least for part of the year, even after Robinson's back. If Gibson's playing well enough, they might ease him back in. I mean, things changed, and we have to respond. Obviously, very unfortunate what happened with Robinson, and I think he will get opportunities, certainly, but it looked like in the preseason that Gibson was going to be running more routes into space and downfield. He caught a pass on like a wide receiver, corner route, like a little flag route over by the sideline on one play. He was doing some of that, and he's getting the early down work. So right now, all of a sudden, his workload while Robinson's out looks fantastic. McKissick basically just playing on, the 3rd and long and obvious passing situations, 2-minute drill stuff. I mean, I think you have to be very optimistic about Gibson in the short term. I think you have to be optimistic about Patterson in the short term. Hunt's probably more of the one that feels a little longer term, although part of me with them making D'Ernest inactive still thinks they're kind of just trying to prove to everyone that if you want to trade for him, you have to pay up, and he might get moved still at some point, right? Because the D'Ernest stuff's weird. They gave him that little extension and pay raise in August. They have Jerome Ford active. He only plays on special teams. Ford doesn't play a single offensive snap. They go only really the 2 backs, just like last year. And Hunt's good. So anyway, I don't know.
I don't think they would mind. I mean, he wants to be traded. They've said he's too good to be traded unless a team pays. But if some team came out of nowhere and actually did pay for him, they would trade him.
Do you think that's a good landing spot is the question? Because I think he could actually be really good in another spot too, because he's good. He's really good at football.
Right. So obviously the big buy low window on Antonio Gibson has closed. If you're in Dynasty, are you buying what you have to assume is a different price, maybe a substantially different price this week, but one that can't get too high because still most people are going to feel like Robinson does come in and take away a huge chunk of important work later on?
Yeah, I'm probably buying for those types of prices that you just described. I mean, something that's recognizes that he lost a lot of value. I mean, I thought he was good in this game. He ran pretty effectively, pretty efficiently, caught a bunch of balls. Looks like he'll probably be the goal line back for the time being, probably not later in the year, right? But I mean, I'm buying. I think Hunt. I was asking you about Hunt. Where are you at on this possibility Hunt could get traded and everything? What would that mean? Does he probably land on a good team? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it would have to be a good landing spot because otherwise
the team wouldn't pay.
Now, you always have some teams that do some slightly weird things. One of the elements that was odd about the Seahawks offseason is they make that nice trade to get rid of a potentially declining Russell Wilson and get a ton back. And then they turn around and they have Rashad Penny and they use a pick that matters on Walker. And that's an interesting one because they are now claiming that Walker actually will play in week 2. We have a lot of both. I don't know that you're necessarily hoping they're playing at the same time. I mean, one of the theories with the Seattle backs is that of all the teams that have 2 interesting backs, that maybe is the one where you see the easiest pathways for the guys to not be playing at the same time just because of some of the injury background, both recent and over time.
And the other thing is of all the 2-man backfields, that might be the backfield where it's the worst situation when they're both playing at the same time because they might not even run a ton of routes. They might be using like a homer. And then the fact that they only ran 49 plays. I mean, Penny still didn't get as much work. He looked fantastic, but he didn't get enough work because they just didn't have the freaking ball enough, right? Like they can't even get one back enough work. So if Walker's out there, what did Penny have? 12 carries for 60 yards or something, looks super explosive. He needs 18, but they don't run enough plays.
Yeah, you got to commit more or convert more first downs. You have to get DK Metcalf more involved. You have to get Noah Fant more involved. That is kind of absurd. He's one of the best tight ends in the NFL. They had a bunch of scheme stuff for some other players early. After that kind of went away, Fant looked like the guy more or less, but you have to let him run some of these routes and be dynamic for you. Now, it worked in the first week. It's almost one of these elements where I think that despite being run heavy, that the Seahawks could benefit from trailing just because there's going to be more urgency. And they have to pick up first downs. They have to score points. Penny and Walker both profile as backs who are so electric that if the offense does show more urgency, I think they will work in just fine. Again, you do need a specific thing to happen. It's the reason why Rashad Penny, despite being one of the most talented backs in football, was still not expensive in fantasy. These are the reasons. You think we're going to see some new young players active in week 2? Could we see Ty Chandler? Could we see Isaiah Spiller? Could we see Tyler Algier?
I don't know.
Some of these teams need some more explosiveness. Now, as long as Dalvin Cook is healthy, the Vikings are going to be relying almost exclusively on him. But
yeah, you're looking for reasons to start Ty Chandler again. Step 1 is make sure he's active. I mean, I think Algier, I would guess they hold out Damian Williams and then Algier gets activated and plays there. Other back, Avery Williams, played on special teams. One of those classic situations where the third back kind of needs to play special teams. Seems like that's why he was activated. Seems like that was part of why Cordero Patterson rushed. Whatever it was, 24 times, 22 times. I think it was like 6 times more than a season high last year. Patterson, a guy that I think is going to be really great for zero RB people to ride for a while. I wish we got a little bit more at him, or at least on a couple of teams, on some zero RB teams, because he's going to be a really nice bridge. And I had people asking, do I sell high? What do I do? I can't rely on him all year. You don't need to know who your running back is in the playoffs right now. I mean, that's part of the whole idea with the running back position. What you do know for Patterson is you're going to get a good month probably right now, at least. And that's a nice thing to know at running back, right? And so take that and be comfortable with that. And you're trying to find answers for down the stretch, but they're not always apparent, right? And so that's tricky. Rashad Penny, great down the stretch last year. We often talk about with the main event stuff, wasn't even on a lot of the rosters because people didn't pick him up before the waivers closed for the year. He ends up being an absolute star down the stretch. And so you're trying to find those guys late. You're trying to find guys early, and you have Patterson early for sure. And I think that looks really good. It would be nice if Williams does sit, Damian Williams sits, that Algier gets some run. That would be nice to see. That's the one that I'm looking for in week 2.
Well, Ben, this has been a lot of fun again. Reacting to week 1, getting to watch week 1, having week 2 right around the corner, probably the most fun time of the fantasy season. We hope that you all will stay with us. We'll get this in-season tempo worked out right now. It looks like we will have shows for you on Wednesday, Thursday, and Saturday, possibly twice a week at some points as opposed to 3 times. But it's just so much fun talking about football. Again, make sure you get in there, subscribe to Stealing Signals, subscribe to Stealing Lines. You don't want to miss that. We'd love to have you over at RotoViz. The guys are doing an absolute fantastic job. Dave Cabin has multiple really cool articles for people working on their start sets, people working on their DFS. He's got a cornerback wide receiver matchup tool that has an insane amount of information in it. He has a new advanced stat team explorer that has stuff you wouldn't believe. Dave's article on the wide receiver matchups, also a must read. You can get a 10% discount using the coupon code RBRadio2022 at checkout. Subscribe to the feed, leave us a rating and review. You guys have been unbelievable with those. Also, I've mentioned it on OT a couple times, but also want to mention it here on Stealing Bananas. Everybody who participated, we appreciate it so much. We announced a few additional winners of 1-month subscriptions, some runners up to that. We did draft the 2 teams. Those teams were really fun. One of the 2 teams is a Barkley Swift squad. that works out very nicely, at least after week 1 with our updated running back rankings. The other team, and I hesitate to even mention this while Ben is in the room, it's a Saquon Barkley, Mark Andrews, A.J. Brown team. The draft let A.J. Brown fall to us in the late 3rd.
Didn't get a lot of those, Sean, as you know. A lot of late draft spots. Had to take Brown early, second sometimes, just to make sure to get some exposure to him. Did not get as much A.J. Brown as I wanted in the main events, just because of draft slots, which is one of my big frustrations. So that's why Sean's saying he hesitates to say that, because that makes me very jealous.
So when Eric and I win the $500,000 in the FBG contest with that team, we'll find Ben and take him out to dinner. Appreciate everybody for listening. We'll talk to you guys soon.